So I'm sure we all know a lot about Egypt, and this morning we're in a book that starts in Egypt, the Exodus, and I'm sure we know lots about Exodus. So kids, you might remember this film, The Prince of Egypt. Maybe adults, you can remember this film as well. So I'm sure lots of us know things about the book of Exodus where we are today. And we're here because we're doing a series in the character of God, and I want to look at the first 2 chapters of Exodus to see what they teach us about God. Because actually, the book of Exodus isn't primarily about Pharaoh, it's not primarily about Moses, it's not even primarily about us. Actually, the book of Exodus is all about God. Now, if you're not sure, let me prove this to you with a couple of verses. So, for example, on the screen, Psalm 106 says this: "When our fathers were in Egypt, they gave no thought to your miracles. They did not remember your many kindnesses as they rebelled by the sea, the Red Sea, yet he saved them for his name's sake, to make his mighty power known." God saved the Israelites for his name's sake. Or if you remember, when they're about to cross the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 14, let me just read this for you on the screen. Exodus chapter 14, it says this: "Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." So Exodus is about the glory of God. Interesting, do you remember, we all know the start of the Exodus. It's all about being saved from Egypt, and then you have the 10 Commandments. We kind of know it there. And then if you've ever read through Exodus, you start to kind of slow down then, unless you're an architect or a Brethren Christian. Some of you from a Brethren background will know how excited you comes when the tabernacle and all of the sizes and all of the columns, and you get really excited. But most Christians really struggle with all of these building instructions for the tabernacle. And Exodus ends with actually a strange ending, but it's actually an amazing ending when you realize that Exodus is all about the glory of God. Because if you look at chapter 40, it says this. Here's Exodus chapter 40. "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." Exodus is all about God. So in this series, in the character of God, we've got to go to Exodus. There's an interesting fact in the book of Exodus. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but we never hear Pharaoh's name. We're never told who he is. We don't get his full name. Even though he saw himself as a god, he thought he was the arch rival of God, he's not given a name, which is, from the author intent, a clear snub. It's a clear snub. I'm not even going to name him. And just to make sure that we get the snub, as we're going to see, he takes time to name the midwives. Midwives should always be named, shouldn't they, Marilyn? Always be named. We should always remember the midwives. I love that. Pharaoh thinks he's a god. We're not going to put your name down. But the midwives, everybody else, we're going to name them. As one writer, Philip Ryken, says, to read Exodus is to encounter God. So we're going to read the first 2 chapters together. As I read through Exodus chapters 1 and 2, I'm going to stop at different points just to comment on what's going on and then hopefully bring out some truths about God that will help us today. Let me read Exodus chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. "These are the names of the son of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his own family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them." Now, here are the people of the history of the Old Testament, the Israelites. This is the sequel to Genesis. At the end of Genesis, they go into Egypt. There's Jacob. They think they've found kind of safety there. There's 12 brothers, and that funny list there, kind of dirty dozen of least likely people to succeed. But this group of 70, actually this starving bunch of misfits, grow. And they grow so much that, as we're going to see, they become public enemy number 1. They fill the land. So have a listen in from verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. I mean, it's intense, isn't it? You start and think, that was a Disney film. I mean, it's an amazing story, isn't it? But it is horrendous when you remember that this is history. Going from slavery to secret murder to mass murder to genocide. It's just like what happened many years ago with the Jewish people. Hate propaganda, trade boycott, banning from certain occupations, racial segregation, ghettos, labor camps, gas chambers. God's people are being persecuted. God's people come under threat. But what we're going to see is there is an answer. And it is an amazing answer. And we've already seen the midwives. They're there with their civil disobedience. But we're going to see an answer in chapter 2. So let's see what happens in chapter 2. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. You know, here are, just like the Hebrew midwives, people of faith. And it's interesting because the New Testament picks up on it. So Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23 comments on this and says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. That's an amazing comment, isn't it? I love the way Hebrews brings out their faith. So they hide their baby boy, and then they hide him in the Nile to see what's going to happen, and the sister goes off to watch it all. So let's see what happens next. Verse 5. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Do you see how everything turns? From hiding your baby to being paid to care for your baby. It's absolutely amazing, isn't it? What I love here is there's so much you're not sure of. So Pharaoh's daughter, why did she pick up the baby? If I can put it like this, was it circumstance or circumcision? So was it just that she happened to see a baby and felt sorry? Or was it that she happened to see a circumcised baby and thought, I'm not going to listen to my dad? And there was a rebellious spirit. We don't know. But wherever she did it, she picks up this baby, and the faith of the parents is answered. Whatever's going on here, we know there's a divine hand at work, particularly when the mother gets employed. He is ultimately now put under royal protection, and the mother is given a royal paycheck. That is the wonderful thing. You see, this is what we've been learning this summer with Peter Price, particularly 2 weeks ago, the providence of God. So often, when we think all is lost, actually, God is doing far more. And the daughter then, Pharaoh's daughter, gives him a name which is a prophetic name, Moses. Draw out, draw out. God is going to do far more. Well, then he grows up and he turns 40, and I think he has a bit of a midlife crisis. I think he has a bit of an identity crisis. So let's have a listen to see what happens from verse 11. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. I don't know. Why did he look around? Did he look around to get away with it? Did he look around to see if people were going to help him? We don't know. And why do it? All we know is he grew up and he had a sense of identity. He grew up and he loved his people. In fact, if you do go to Hebrews 11 later on, the author of Hebrews 11 says that he chose to be mistreated with his people rather than be rich. He loved his people so much, he was happy to give up everything. And because of this, he lost everything. Have a look at what happens, verse 13. The next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. That is a quick loss of everything, isn't it? Overnight, he has lost everything. He's lost the family he grew up in, he's lost royal protection, he's lost that identity, but he's also now lost his people who he's tried to help, and they have now turned on him. He has lost everything. But he's going to do another rescue attempt. But this time, the rescue attempt is going to have a better reaction. Let's read on of what happens next, verse 16, where he's in Midian. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." And where is he?" Reuel asked the daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." So all is not lost. Moses has rescued, he has been welcomed, and now he has found a new family. But there's more going on. There's much more going on. So let's read to the end of the chapter. Verse 23, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help became, or because their cry for God because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Even though chapters 1 and 2 are amazing, we end chapter 2 by looking at God. Whatever the answer to the problem is, it isn't Moses. Even if Moses is going to be used, the answer is God. And those last 3 verses are key. God hears, God remembers. The big word is God, God, God. So, what I want to do this morning is just share with us 3 truths about God when we find ourselves in situations that might be similar. What I mean is situations where we're in difficulty, we're struggling, where we're suffering. So here's the first truth I think we learn from Exodus 1 and 2. It's this: God always hears you when you suffer. God always hears you when you suffer. I wonder, are you suffering this morning? Perhaps you're suffering because you're enslaved to a sin and you can't get out of it. Or you've been hurt by the sin of another. Perhaps you feel desperate. Perhaps you feel you're clinging on this morning to your faith by your fingernails and you feel like God has forgotten you. You know, how you view God in those times determines how you respond. How you view someone affects how you react to them. So you might be here this morning, and when you think of God, he's not really even a footnote in your life. You're basically a functional deist. What I mean is this: yes, God's created the world. Yes, God is all-powerful, but God isn't involved in the day-to-day of life. If there's a problem, you've probably made that problem, and you need to get yourself out of the problem. For some of us, that's what we think. There's no point bothering God, because in the end, what would the creator of the entire universe, what would he want to do giving me time as little old me in Abergavenny with my problem? Surely there's so much else going on in the world. Why would he listen to my problem? Some of us, God is not even a footnote in our lives. Others of us struggle because actually we see God more like a personal genie. So we actually think that if we ask God, he should give us what we want, because that's his job, isn't it? We rub his belly, and next thing, the answer comes. And actually for us then, when we struggle and we ask God and he doesn't give us what we want when we want it, we get incredibly disappointed. We even get angry. God seems unfair. I think it's in the midst of suffering that we ask the most questions. I think ultimately that's what suffering does, isn't it? It puts huge question marks in our lives. Why? What for? Why me? Why has God done this to me? What does God think of me? Does God care? You remember the disciples in the boat with Jesus in the midst of a storm. What do? They go to Jesus and say, "Don't you care if we drown?" It's the big question. Does God really care? I want you to notice in chapter 1 the amount of names. Notice the names. No name of Pharaoh. We don't care. But the Israelites, the names are there. I love that. Whatever this rescue is going to be about in the book of Exodus, it is about individuals. Whatever that comment is at the end of chapter 2 about God hearing, he's not just hearing the people, he's hearing every person. That's a big theme in the Bible. God giving names, God knowing names. It's so important to know this morning that if you are struggling or suffering, God hears you. We have, if you are a Christian, a personal God. He knows us, he knows you. He cared for them, and he cares for you. Here's some facts from the Bible for you. God knows everything. And not just all of our sin and shame, but all of our fears and frights. He knows the number of hairs on our head. He knows the worries that wake us up in the middle of the night. He knows the anger that we wake up with. He knows that person and what they've done to you. He knows how you're feeling on the inside. He knows everything. And he knows when you cry. And as one scripture says, he collects those tears in a bottle. That is our God. We need to know that we have a God who hears us. But we do need more than that, don't we? Someone hearing you is great, but it's only great if they do something about it. How many people are attacked in broad daylight in the middle of a town centre and no one does anything? If they do anything these days, they just film it for Facebook. People shouting out for help and no one coming. Or maybe someone who listens and they're just a sympathetic listener. You know, someone who goes, cup of tea, but doesn't do more than that. Is that God? Is he a distant hearer or a sympathetic listener? Well, the second thing to see in Exodus chapters 1 and 2 is this. Not only does God hear us when we're suffering, but secondly, God is always at work behind the scenes. God is always at work behind the scenes. You see, if you were to read chapters 1 and 2, it would be easy without those last 3 verses to just think, Wow, that was lucky. Gosh, I can't believe the baby got saw in the River Nile. Well, that was a fluke. That was happenstance. But actually, what we're seeing in chapters 1 and 2 is that God is at work behind the scenes. Do you notice how it ends? God remembers his covenant. When he hears their cry, he remembers. You see, God has promised to be with them. And actually, if you read chapters 1 and 2, did you see the covenant promises being fulfilled? Have you ever thought of Exodus chapters 1 and 2 as proof that God's covenant promises are fulfilled? So do you remember God's covenant? He comes and he says, I will make you a people as numerous as the sands on the seashore, as the stars in the heavens. That's one of the 3 big promises. I'll also give you a land. You'll also live under my rule. But this is fascinating, isn't it? Because what is the one thing that's repeated in chapters 1 and 2? The author keeps reminding us, and they grew in number, and they grew in number. And no matter how hard they stopped them or tried to stop them, they still grew in number. That is to show us in Exodus chapters 1 and 2 that God's covenant is still at work. It hasn't stopped. You see, what happens when we suffer is we forget that God is at work. And we stop seeing how God is at work. We miss God in all of the work. Let me show you something up on the screen. I'm not sure if, are we able to, is that possible? Sorry. If we go back a screen, oh, there we are. Note to that one just there. Perfect. I shared this when I preached on Esther a while ago. There's a story, and you've heard me say it when I preached on the book of Esther. There's a story about a man who was in hospital, and he was an atheist and an ardent atheist. And he really wanted to teach his grandson a lesson. So when his grandson came to his bedside in his dying days, he said to his grandson, to make sure he had a good atheist education, he said to him, what does the sign above the bed say? What does it say? And so his grandson, who was quite young, tried to read it, and he couldn't quite make out the second word. So he read, God is now here. God is now here. And we've got to remember, Exodus 1 and 2 is teaching us that sometimes God seems to be nowhere, but actually it's in those minutes and in those times that God is now here. Perhaps this morning you're struggling and you're suffering. This is the time to pause and to remember, I may not be able to see God, but God is there. God is there. How many times have you heard the story? You've probably heard this 101 times. Remember about the man and he's stuck on a desert island? Not the one that builds 2 chapels, that's for another sermon, isn't it? But remember the man who's on the desert island and he's desperate to be helped. So he prays to God, God, please save me from this desert island. And next thing, a plane comes over and the man waves and he shouts up, it's okay, I've prayed to God, he's going to rescue me. And so the plane flies off. And then a ship comes on the horizon. Andrew Ward shouts out, Captain Ward, do you want help? And he shouts back to Andrew, it's okay, Captain. I've prayed to God, he's going to rescue me. And off he goes. Next thing, a submarine bobs out to the sea. And out comes the man, do you want some help? No, it's okay, I've prayed to God, he's going to help me. And off goes the submarine. And the man starves to death. It's a bit of an ending to a joke, isn't it? And he starves to death. And then he meets God in heaven. He says, God, why didn't you help me? And he said, well, I did. Sent you a plane and a boat and a submarine. The problem is, in our difficulties, very often God is helping us. He is working, but we miss it. We miss it. It's often through others. It's often through circumstances that we think, oh, I made that happen. I caused that. They did that. Yes, but it was God. It was God in the background making all of these things happen. That's the quote that was going to come up on the screen now. This is what Mike Wilkerson says. I don't know if this is possible. God is not a silent, detached, distant, dispassionate deity. He hears his people's cries. He knows their suffering. He will keep his promise. He will rescue them. So let me give you a third and very quick final point this morning. Here's the third point this morning. God will rescue you in his way and in his time. I think this is the difficulty, isn't it? This is the nuance. So we believe God hears us. We believe that God is at work. But what Exodus 1 and 2 teaches us is that God will rescue us, but it's in his time and in his way. See, that's the tricky point, isn't it? When I'm struggling, I want God to rescue me, and I want him to rescue me now. I wish God worked on my timing. Do you wish that? Do you wish God would just work on our timing? But we need to understand when we read the Bible that actually God works on his timing. So I want now for there to be no more pain, no more suffering, no more death. I want that to happen now. But God will give that, but not yet. But not yet. God saves even if it isn't immediately. And I think the problem is, what we do then is we react in one of two ways. When the timing isn't right, we react in one of two ways. So some of us react in anger, and some of us react in taking over. It's interesting, Moses struggled with the timing, didn't he? It's interesting the way the New Testament picks up on it. Remember Stephen. Stephen in his sermon in Acts chapter 6. I'll put it up on the screen for you. Stephen in Acts chapter 6 says this. Then when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. It's interesting, isn't it? It's all about what Moses decided to do. He saw it and he did something. Some respond with anger, let's just kill, let's do something. And some respond with taking over. Moses thought he could save the day. Moses had to spend a long time learning that he couldn't do it. Moses had to spend a long time learning to trust in God's timing. If you're struggling this morning, perhaps one of the biggest prayers we can have is, "God, teach me your timing." I've been reading through Isaiah this summer, and one of the themes that comes out, particularly around Isaiah 40, is the need to trust in God's timing. That those who wait on the Lord, they will be built up. They will know. Does that mean that when we're struggling, when we're suffering, we shouldn't do anything? Should we just sit back and do nothing? Well, no, I don't think that's the answer. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Moses clearly gets things wrong and has to run away and learn a lesson. But the midwives, they seem to get things right. So here's a question. Why do the midwives get a blessing, but Moses has to run away? Because they both try to help. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Could it be the difference between civil disobedience and murder? So could it be that the midwives acted within God's law, but Moses didn't? I think that's what we see there. I think the midwives did do what they could do, and they did it trusting the Lord. Whereas Moses did what he wanted to do there and then. And that wasn't right. And I think that's the big difference. If you're struggling this morning, I'm not saying sit back and do nothing. Let go and let God. Some of you have been brought up on that. I don't quite believe in that phrase. I don't think it's very helpful, let go and let God. Sometimes we've got to do things. But the question is it what the Lord wants us to do? We can't get angry and we can't take matters into our own hands. But we can pray. We can fight in the right biblical sense of it, when we're fighting for rights or injustice. But we've got to make sure that we do it in a way that honors the Lord. Let me end with this thought. I love Exodus chapter 1 and 2. I love the picture we get of God. I love the fact that God hears us. I love the fact that he's at work behind the scenes. I love the fact that he ultimately will save us, even if his timing isn't the same as our timing. But do you know what else I love about the Lord when we suffer? If you read the whole Bible, and particularly the New Testament, you realize that actually not only does God hear us, but actually God understands us. That when we're suffering, he understands what we're going through. Because you see, there was another baby, wasn't there? Who a death threat was put out on his life. And there was another baby who they had to hide, this time not in the Nile, but actually this time they had to take him to Egypt to be protected. There was one actually who grew up, who knew what it was to be persecuted, who knew what it was to be an immigrant, who knew what it was to have to seek asylum in another country, who knew what it was to be stabbed in the back by best friends, who knew what it was to have family members misunderstand him, who knew what it was to be homeless at certain times, who knew what it was to be lied about, to face injustice, and knew what it was to face every type of pain. That's the Lord Jesus. And the God who hears us is the God of Exodus, and that God of Exodus is the Lord Jesus. You know, God in Exodus reveals himself as the I am, and the Lord Jesus repeatedly just keeps coming and saying, I am, I am, I am. You know, if you're struggling this morning, you have a God in Jesus who hears you, who has died for you, who is working on your behalf now. Perhaps you won't see it, but he is working on your behalf, and one day will make everything right. Will make everything right. It was so wonderful this morning. I won't say who it was. One church member came up to me this morning and said, isn't it a wonderful thought that dear Ray this morning can hear the music perfectly again? And there he is now with heavenly worship, hearing it properly. You've got to hold on to those truths. God is with us, and we will be with him forever. And so if you're suffering this morning, the Lord Jesus says this to you, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest.